All Indiana Politics is your premier source for Indiana politics, focusing on issues that matter to you.
I still want us to be the best in the Midwest.
We can't afford another lockdown.
Give the citizens of this country the relief they need.
Education in the state of Indiana remains priority number one.
In-depth, nonpartisan coverage.
We don't know exactly where the economy will be in January.
People are worried with good reason.
Exclusive interviews with Indiana's political leaders.
We have the resources here in the state of Indiana to care for those who are in need.
Expert analysis on critical legislation.
We need to reform those laws.
This recovery is going to take some time.
We've got to anticipate that there'll be a budget shortfall.
From Wish TV, this is All Indiana Politics Podcast on the All Indiana Podcast Network.
I'm Garrett Bergquist, government reporter for Wish TV and the producer of All Indiana Politics. Voters in Indiana's largest congressional district will pick a new member of Congress this fall. Congressman Larry Bucshon is retiring after 14 years in Congress. He represents the 8th District, which stretches from the Ohio River to Terre Haute and from the southwest corner of the state almost all the way to Bloomington. 3 men are running to succeed him: Republican Mark Messmer, Democrat Erik Hurt, and Libertarian Richard Fitzlaff. I asked all 3 of them for interviews. Messmer declined, while Hurt and Fitzlaff accepted my invitation. Erik Hurt manages a movie theater in Evansville. He tells me he got into the race to help working-class Hoosiers. Joining us now is Erik Hurt, the Democratic candidate for the 8th District. Erik, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Why are you running for Congress?
I grew up with working class parents. I saw the amount of work that they put in to try and make a good life for me, for my family, and I've seen that kind of work be devalued year after year after year. People who think that people working in service positions, in factory jobs, the jobs that we saw through COVID in 2020 were the essential jobs, those essential workers. And you have people who say they don't deserve a living wage, that they don't deserve good benefits, that they don't deserve health care because of these jobs. And I believe that these people are the backbone of our country, of our economy. Nothing moves without the working people, and making sure that they're getting a fair shake, that they're not being exploited and oppressed by billionaires and these executives is so crucial. And just making sure that they get time off, that they get parental leave, that they're able to take care of themselves. That's why I'm running, to make sure that these people have all the advantages and opportunities that a country like America should be able to afford them.
So the economy is playing a big role in this election, as you just alluded to, especially when it comes to inflation and the cost of housing. What are your plans to address those issues?
Absolutely. So I believe, and we've seen this in reports, that a large driver of that inflation is corporate greed. That's what we've seen. And there are proposals already put in place by people like Senator Elizabeth Warren for things like windfall profit taxes, which would look at when companies are raising prices, bringing in record profits, that we are taxing that money and putting it back into the pockets of working class people. In terms of the housing crisis, there are a lot of issues going into that. One of the main ones being overseas corporations buying single-family homes, renters buying multiple single-family properties that are, spending a majority of the year just vacant or empty. These people are driving up the cost of housing. We need to make sure we're implementing taxes on multiple rental properties, preventing these mega corporations from buying out these single homes, as well as just making sure we're investing in building homes and communities for people. There are also proposals put in place to offer tax incentives for first-time home buyers, which I think is incredibly important, so that we're not just having a generation of people spending thousands and thousands of dollars to landlords, but actually giving the opportunity to get a home and start building that generational wealth.
You've called for a $20 an hour minimum wage, a 32-hour work week, and 6 weeks of paid vacation for all workers. How do you ensure that those costs don't result in higher prices for consumers?
Absolutely. So the drive for that, it's looking at the cost of living. It's looking at our rates of production, because we are more productive now than we have ever been because of technological advancements, and yet we're still sitting at the same work week we were nearly 100 years ago. We've seen these proposals have tremendous success in other parts of the world, whether it's the 6 weeks paid vacation. Most countries in Europe, that is standard. The 32-hour work week has shown to be a massive success. And part of how we make sure we structure that correctly is, again, making sure we're having the ultra-wealthy paying their fair share. And you can have people either bring in those profits or making sure that they're investing it into their people. Because we have the money to pay people $20 an hour right now. That money is there. It is in the economy. The problem is that when you look at executive pay compared to the average worker, back in the 60s, the 70s, it was about 15 times a CEO made what their average worker made. Now it's 300 to 400 times. And so we need to make sure we are making our tax structure so that that money can't be hoarded by that top 1%, which it has been since we implemented trickle-down economics and Reaganomics. We need to restructure that to make sure we're investing in our workers and not just putting money into executives and CEOs' pockets.
Okay, but how do you ensure that those policies, once required of companies, don't result in the companies passing the costs of those benefits on to consumers in the form of higher prices?
And so that comes in with the greedflation. It's, again, there's the money to do it if they're willing to do it. And so you have things like windfall profit taxes, you have those protections. And something I also believe in is we have all of these metrics to chart what the cost of living is, and to chart inflation, and to chart all these things. If we are not using that to then adjust the minimum wage, what is the point of having all these metrics? We can use those metrics to put systems in place to where that minimum wage increases. And so if you have these people driving the cost of prices up, well, then there are these systems in place that say, okay, well, now you have to pay workers more. And there are obviously things we can do to make sure it protects small businesses, things like tax incentives for small businesses to make sure that they're not facing an undue consequence of these rising prices. But people who work at small businesses, they deserve that as well. They deserve those benefits. They deserve that improvement in quality of life. But we can put those systems in place to make sure that we are adjusting for that increased costs, particularly for small businesses.
What's your plan for the southern border?
The southern border, I think, comes with a lot of feelings-based approaches. People see people who maybe look different from them, who speak a different language, and it has been used to kind of scapegoat these people, immigrants, people coming across the border, as a bigger problem than it actually is. And we've seen stories about, people, like an invasion, and then people go down and it's not happening. And so you have this sort of culture of fear around it. And when I look at my policies and when I look at how I want to govern, I think of facts, statistics, expert analysis, and then leading from a place of empathy and understanding. So when you look at facts and statistics, everything says that the average immigrant, illegal or otherwise, is committing less crime than a U.S. citizen born in this country. And then when you look at how much they are providing communities in tax revenue, in jobs, the amount that they provide for industries like agriculture, like food service. People coming across the border are a huge part of that. So that's something I want to make clear, is that this is a boon to many of our communities. Certainly in rural Indiana, we have a lot of people coming from across the border who are contributing so much to these communities, where a lot of people have left. So the plan at the border is to, again, lead with empathy and understanding and look at the issues that are happening, because there are drugs that come over, there are those issues, but we can look at root causes. So say you look at drugs, is it a border issue or is it an opioid issue? Is it a drug issue? How can you attack that, and how can you get to the root cause of that problem in this country, which often deals with poverty, with mental health? People don't do drugs just because they want to do drugs. There is an intrinsic link between poverty, negative mental health, and substance abuse. And we can look at tackling that to tackle the actual issues happening at the border, not just people coming through. And so I think that is an important part of tackling that issue and finding ways to make the citizenship process for people coming across easier, more straightforward, so that we can get these people in and help build our country up better, because we are a country of immigrants. Immigrants have made this country what it is, and that needs to continue.
That leads me to my next question. What about America's legal immigration system?
Yeah, so I mean, it's incredibly bottlenecked. We have people waiting years and years and years to go through that process, and a big part of it is investing money into expediting that process. When you look at how these institutions work, and I particularly think of the IRS in this situation, where when we put money into investing in the IRS, getting more employees, getting more people going through tax returns, it returned billions of dollars from mostly millionaire and billionaires who were avoiding paying these taxes. We invested in it properly, and we got more in return because we put that investment in. If we invest in more people going through immigration applications, making sure there are more people available to make that process go quicker, we can have more people go through that process, and so that way they can be documented, they can become American citizens, and they can be part of this country. And I think if you have that process sped up, you are going to see a drastic decrease in illegal immigration, because people want to come through. They want to come through legally, and they want to have those protections and benefits of being an American citizen. But we put so many obstacles in the way of that when people are in a desperate situation and just trying to find some way to provide for themselves. And you're looking at things like in Mexico. Mexico City has a severe water crisis because of climate change. And we're seeing that in a lot of cities. We've seen that in South Africa. We're seeing that in the Colorado River here in the States, where we have people who are water insecure, and that is definitely happening in Mexico. So you have people who have little access to clean water, who are trying to find a way to survive. And so if we give them those opportunities, they will take those opportunities.
Would you support a federal abortion law?
A federal abortion law to protect abortion?
To protect or regulate abortion, anyway.
Yes. So I believe when it comes to issues like that, I think a federal approach should be required, because when you leave it to the states and you leave people vulnerable in that way, it proportionally negatively impacts low-income communities. Because if you are wealthy, if you are in that position, you're always going to be able to go to another state where it's legal. You're always going to be able to travel to get that health care that you need, where if you're in a poor or marginalized community, you may not have access to that kind of transportation. You may not be able to take the time off of work, or all of these other things that negatively impact low-income people. And so you're going to see a greater disparity. And so I am obviously in favor of abortion, of a woman's rights to choose. And so I think making sure that that is legal nationwide, so that there isn't that greater disparity between the rich and poor when it comes to that issue, is crucial. And there are things that can be left to the states and how they manage certain things, but that's not one of them.
So what standard would you support in a federal abortion law? In
a federal abortion law, I think it's important that we have it open, because when you look at some of the issues as to why they try and keep it banned, or the narratives they push, and certainly Donald Trump saying they're doing abortions after birth, which is just not a thing, or a large amount of third trimester abortions. Those are incredibly rare, and only in incredibly dire circumstances. And again, empathy and understanding a person who has carried a fetus to term only to have an abortion. That means the pregnant person's life is certainly in a tremendous amount of danger at that point. And if we restrict an ability to for somebody to get that care, we are putting people's lives at risk. And we've seen that. We've seen that in Georgia, where someone was bleeding out. They weren't able to receive the health care that they could have gotten, that could have saved her life, because doctors were afraid of what they could do and if they would be criminalized for taking action to save this woman's life. And so I think putting restrictions onto when is only going to cost lives. It's not going to increase the rate of abortions. It's only going to increase the rate of unsafe abortions.
We had another school shooting this fall, this time at a high school in Georgia. How should Congress address this issue? Because other countries don't have the same level of firearm homicides we do.
No, absolutely. And when you look at it, and it's pretty clear when these other countries, whether it's Australia, whether it's countries in Europe, when they put firearm regulations in place, they have drastically fewer, not just mass shootings like we see in the United States, but violent crime in general, and certainly violent homicides. There are, first of all, assault rifle bans should be a no-brainer. That's common sense. We need, common sense gun storage laws to make sure that, when parents, like in the case of this recent shooting, aren't properly storing these firearms and giving kids the opportunity to, just get their hands on them without training, without any kind of, background testing or anything like that, we're putting people's lives at risk, and we just are. And there's obviously a lot of things that people consider when they look at gun regulation, particularly with things like AR-15s and why they don't want to see them banned. But when you look at the realities of the situation, when you look at our violent crime, when you look at our mass shootings, and you compare it to all of these other countries, we are needlessly putting people's lives at risk. And leading to so many more deaths than we need to. And it's, I think, really unfortunate that this idea of a right to bear arms, or that freedom, is put over the freedom of being able to go into your community and feel safe, to be able to go into a school and feel safe, to walk around and know that you're not going to be shot. I think we have to look at those different kinds of freedoms and how do we want to structure our society. And so I think a ban on assault weapons, common sense gun storage laws, universal background checks, these are all things that aren't really infringing on anyone's rights, because it is creating an environment of more freedom and more opportunity where people can just be safe to live their lives.
You mentioned bans on military-style rifles. What about the, frankly, millions of such rifles that are already in circulation?
Yeah, so there are obviously, things like, mandatory, buyback things, and obviously, I think putting effort towards, collecting these guns, making sure that they are not in the hands of people who are going to do harm. Now, that is a big process, and that is a process that would result in a lot of pushback. It would, of course it would. But we have to be able to make sure we are not kind of being held hostage by that situation. Because when you have all of these people dying, that's sort of the situation we're in. And so I think it's important that we, make those efforts to get those guns off the streets, out of our communities. And again, looking at how this has worked in other countries. They did, similar things in Australia, in the UK. And it worked, and it can work here. And I think most people believe in those common sense regulations. They believe in common sense. And certainly most Hoosiers believe in common sense. And I think if we put those systems in place, we have the resources, we have the people who can do that job, with our police force, we can make that happen.
Our national debt is now at $35 trillion and climbing. What's your plan to get it under control?
I think we have to look at how we do reasonable spending. It's not about cutting programs. It's not about cutting taxes. Cutting taxes is only going to increase that problem, particularly with the Trump tax cuts on the ultra wealthy, on corporations, because we're taking money out of our pool. We have to look at reasonable and responsible spending, and a lot of that comes with long-term vision when it comes to things, and not just short-term gains. And so when we're looking at infrastructure, when we're looking at how we're building our communities, designing our communities, we have to not just be putting Band-Aids on things, whether it's roads, whether it's sidewalks, highways. We need to make sure we're investing and to modernizing these things so that they're longer lasting, and that we're not faced with these kind of extreme costs when things go wrong. And so looking at how we can best invest our money for long-term success is important. Raising taxes on the ultra wealthy, I think, is important in order to get more money back. And these are things like wealth taxes, like they did in Massachusetts. 2% on people worth over $100 million, 4% on people worth over $500 million, put billions into the Massachusetts state budget. We can implement those on a federal level, and we can see that debt dissipate, but we have to make sure we're doing that. The money's there to overcome that debt if we look at long-term vision, make sure we're not just constantly spending, but actually making things more secure, and looking at ways that we can design things so that we're spending less. And I think part of that is more dense, walkable cities. Because when you look at the cost of infrastructure and the cost of road maintenance, highway maintenance, some of that, a big part of that, is we are so car dependent in this country that for the vast majority of Americans, if they want to go anywhere outside of their house, they have to drive a car. And so that puts an incredible amount of stress on our roads, which means an incredible amount of money we have to spend on our roads. And if we build our communities around people, we can greatly offset that cost in the long term. Would it cost money to rebuild our cities around people? Of course it would. Would it cost money to rebuild our public transportation? Of course it would. But we have to have leaders who think in the long term, because we've been lacking that. And the lack of that long-term vision has seen our infrastructure crumble. Look at the state of our bridges. Look at the state of our highways. We are in dire straits because we lacked that long-term investment strategy. And we need to get back to that.
Let's turn to foreign policy for a moment. Would you support continuing military aid to Ukraine?
To Ukraine, yes, I would support it. I think that Putin, he is in for a drastic grasp for power. He wants to hold on to it in the Soviet Union, or in Russia. What he wants to get back to the Soviet Union, and he wants to take back the Eastern Bloc. I mean, that's very clear. And so I think if we are not supporting the Ukraine and we're not supporting other Eastern European countries, they're going to see themselves under that same kind of occupation that Ukraine is facing right now.
What about Israel?
Israel, I think, is a different set of circumstances. I think, obviously, Israel occupies a very unique position in the world, and where we are finding ourselves in is that Israel has perpetuated a significant amount of civilian casualties in Palestine. And when we see that level of civilian casualties, and we see the humanitarian crisis that has been created in Palestine, I think we have to look at international law, and we have to make sure that we are trying to follow that as best we can. And if that means pulling back our funding, pulling back arms sales to Israel, I think that's important. Now, we obviously want to make sure that we are making sure that the Jewish people, not just in Israel, but all around the world, are being safe, are being protected, that anti-Semitism is being, condemned in all of its forms. But we have to also make sure that we're not contributing to the high amount of civilian casualties that we're seeing in Gaza.
What makes you the best choice in this race?
I lead from a place of empathy and understanding for working class people. My opponent, Mark Messmer, is an extremist. He is a far-right MAGA extremist, and his policies that he has helped contribute in Indiana at the state level have led to Indiana being near the bottom in educational attainment, near the bottom in quality of life, near the bottom in wage growth. We have some of the worst maternal mortality rates in the country, and we are having young people flee, we are having doctors flee, we are having businesses flee. And that is a direct result of the Republican supermajority, which Mark Messmer is absolutely a part of. He would bring those same failed policies to the entire country. We've seen it, we know. The Republican Party has been in control of Indiana for 20 years. There is nobody to blame for where Indiana is on those metrics but Republicans like Mark Messmer. Richard Fitzlaff, there are more things that we agree with, but the libertarian approach is one of limited government that would lead too many people to be marginalized, to be oppressed, to be exploited. We have to use the government as a tool to protect ourselves, to protect working class people, to enrich working class people's lives, and not just hand it over to the ultra wealthy. And that is where I'm governing from. I'm a working class individual. I run a movie theater. I come from a family of immigrants from Poland. I know the lives and the struggles and the obstacles of working class people in America, and I will govern from that place of understanding, putting people first, above corporate interest, above corporate bottom lines, and that's why I'm the right choice for Indiana.
Erik Hurt, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. This was a pleasure.
That was Erik Hurt, Democratic candidate for Indiana's 8th Congressional District. You have until October 7th to register to vote if you have not done so. Early voting begins on October 8th. And remember, you can catch All Indiana Politics every Sunday morning at 9:30, only on Wish TV. I'm Garrett Bergquist. Thanks for listening.
From Wish TV, this is All Indiana Politics Podcast on the All Indiana Podcast Network. Watch All Indiana Politics live Sunday mornings at 9:30 on Wish TV and at wishtv.com. Subscribe to this podcast and listen weekly here on the All Indiana Podcast Network. And be sure to discover even more great podcasts at allindianapodcastnetwork.com.